So I want to move from the philosophical, technological, civilizational criteria to the very practical application of media, news media particularly. I put there media development. It could be also communication development, but the idea is that if today, like in the United States, people who spend more than half of their time when they are awake with one or another media. So media is so dominant in our high-tech culture that we have to have a special look on the role of media. And media, as Majid Tehranian defines, can be divided to small media, big media. It can be anything from the traditional broadcast newspapers to new media and the 21st century applications of internet technology. So let's try to focus on this. And I have done a little bit of homework. I made this summary. Of course, you can study history from whatever point of view. If you study world communication and you study the development of communications, like I take the Majid Tehranian's his classification, because I follow very much Majid's, Professor Tehranian's approach. I have followed from when he was alive. We worked in a way together, and I have followed for a long time. But if you look at his way of categorizing how the world in this broad perspective has developed, that we have had different social systems. We still have. It doesn't mean this is not a linear chronological order. We still have tribal and agrarian feudal social systems. It doesn't mean that everything is moving towards something, that we are moving towards what he calls communitarian society. But anyway, there are different social systems that use different communication technologies, have always used, and they have different cultural paradigms. And furthermore, different elites who master the communication technology, and then there's the institutions, which I like to point out before we go back to my own approach. But if you look at this approach, and we can pass the former or this type of agrarian tribal societies, because we don't know much about them, and I'm going to the modern communications media. But if you look at the birth of mass media like film and broadcasting, they really started during or as a consequence of industrial capitalism. Tehranian avoids using terms like capitalism, feudalism. The ism is always very difficult because it implies ideological components. And I also want to avoid politicizing too much, even though we can speak very safely about commercial industrial capitalism, technocratic capitalism, because it was a kind of social system that emerged mainly in Europe and America at the end of or during the 19th century and 20th century. But they also, that was an era that ideology became dominant cultural paradigm. So if it was more methodology, religion, or something before, even before the industrial era, science and reason were the paradigm of the elite. And we had the birth of intellectuals and the birth of university. So in a way, we are gathering now in an institution that was much more stronger as a communication institution before than what it is now, because the development of technocracy brought the technology paradigm and also the new technologies and different type of institutions that were kind of technocratic, national and global institutions that replaced the traditional role of university. University was no more center of creating and disseminating information and knowledge, and now in the communitarian era it could be even more so that who are the elites? If they are not university professors, not the intellectuals, who are the ones who in a way communicate globally in today's world? How are they being chosen, educated and given power? And my view is, in this summary, is that we can forget the time before 1945. It is not that we should be ignorant, just quite contrary. The propaganda has been with us always. It was the Catholic Church that invented the whole concept of propaganda. They wanted to control that the priests and the functionaries propagate, circulate the correct, right information and doctrine and so forth. But I leave it now for historical analysis, and I want to concentrate on the period of the World Wars and Cold War period. We have to use this term. We like it or don't, not, it is still the term that is has been dominant for so many communication and media developments that the mass media and propaganda methods and media were developed more or less in the 1930s and then after. That after the Second World War, it was divided between the political powers, United States, America, and Soviet Union as the opponents. But the media, if you take a very brief look at how was the media before the Second World War, of course, when the radio came, it broke national borders. Motion picture film already was very rapidly developed everywhere by the American film industry, by the Russian Soviet film industry, German and so forth. But radio was, from the propaganda point of view, was something very different, because with the radio you were no more able to stop the flow of information on national borders. With the film, motion picture, you simply could stop exporting or importing films. With the newspapers, you could have censorship of traditional way, you just simply don't let it be sold. But with the radio, it did not work anymore. And for the radio propaganda, if you analyze the birth or the early years of radio, it started, I'm now speaking about the international radio broadcasting. Forget the domestic. Many countries had already radio domestically used at the end of, before the 1920s, and local domestic broadcast, but internationally started somehow 28 or after, and one of the pioneering broadcaster internationally was Moscow Radio, Communist International, and in English, in foreign languages, including English. That aroused a lot of embarrassment in the West, particularly in England. There was even a debate in the House of Commons that how can it be accepted that a foreign broadcaster broadcasts in the English language. What can you do about it? And there were some efforts in some countries, like in in the Baltic Sea, Baltic countries, that they had to somehow prevent Russian propaganda, radio propaganda, and the jamming or deliberate interference into the signal of the foreign broadcaster were discussed, and we usually associate this jamming with the Soviet Union after the Cold War, when it's tried to stop Western broadcasts to the Soviet Union area. But the first jamming, by the way, did not take place between Russia or America or Britain. It took place in Austria, when the Dollfuss government in Austria used jamming against Italian broadcasts because they had disagreements of Trieste region. So it has its own history, but it started, and then the British broadcasting, public broadcasting, BBC, started its broadcasts in 1932 because they also wanted to propagate the British Commonwealth of Nations, the British worldwide imperium throughout the world. So it was a public broadcaster, in a way similar to the Moscow radio, but it was not regarded as ideological, even though it was a British way of looking at the world. Americans, United States, did not enter into international broadcasting at that time, for the simple reason that American broadcasting was commercial, and ABC, RCA, NBC, CBS, and it was not allowed to have commercial messages internationally. In fact, I can show you a little bit later, the first American official public international broadcasting propaganda took place, started in 1942, when Voice of America was inaugurated, and it had its first broadcast to Germany in the German language. That was the time that Japan also had entered the war. So that took place in the radio propaganda war. We can analyze more detailed, but the interesting thing is that it started before the Second World War, but the Cold War, which was declared more or less 1948, but it started already maybe a little bit before, but 48, it brought a different atmosphere to international media. This analysis of the Cold War period is a little bit not biased, but it is one-sided if we don't look at the world outside Soviet Union and the United States. Already that time, China was very active broadcaster. Chinese radio and broadcasting was one of the biggest in terms of hours, broadcast hours throughout the world. And in Europe, for example, Chinese Beijing radio used Albania. Albania was the port or distribution center for Chinese radio propaganda throughout the world, but basically to Europe. It's very interesting to look at now, today's Albania, what role it has and what role it had before. But this is now a political analysis. The contents is different. I come back to the contemporary situation in a moment, but let me point out that I have put here term new aligned or non-aligned world, new world information and communication order. This is interesting because at the time when the world was divided, Cold War division, East and West, Americans and Russian, Soviets, and allied countries. So all countries were somehow linked, not to these two polar centers, but there are many countries that were not did not think that they can accept. They are not part of this division. The movement of non-land countries emerged. Bandung in Indonesia was a place that it started already in the 50s, and India, Nehru, Sukarno in Indonesia, and then Egypt, Iraq, Yugoslavia above all, were active players who wanted to have a different approach to world order. And they also started to develop a more balanced information and communication networks. So this is important to remember, that when we are talking now the situation of in the 2000s and after, there's history. And this history is very relevant to UNESCO, which I worked at that time and analyze in a minute. But that the UNESCO was a forum where the intellectuals, leaders, media, journalists, specialists tried to gather and promote a new world information and communication order, which was a kind of parallel to new international economic order. And new international economic order was developed more or less during the 70s, 73. One of the countries active at that time was Algeria, by the way. If you look at the countries which are now suffering from different type of problems, they were actively trying to promote a new type of world international economic order. More fair price to the raw materials, more fair international trade arrangements, more balanced flow of goods and services, and balanced flow of information above all. And they also wanted to develop alternative news agencies. Latin Americans were very active, particularly Chile. At that time, it was Salvador Allende was president of Chile. There were very famous scholars in Mexico, in Colombia, Brazil, who were highly educated. They developed the scholarly work of what it could be. And for example, Sweden was, and some of the Nordic and European countries, Holland was very actively supporting these efforts. One example was in the news analysis. I can quote, for example, Fernando Reyes Mata, Juan Somavia, whom I knew personally and worked personally. They're still active, retired but active people. But they gave examples of the news flow. What is wrong with the news flow? They didn't want to say that, look, American or European news agencies are wrong, but they look at the things from their point of view. They don't bring a more broader, more balanced picture. And an example is, for example, a news analysis of what did the international news agencies, what did they report of the development of bauxite. Bauxite, it's a raw material. There are very few countries producing bauxite, but it's like any other raw material that are mainly produced in developing countries, mainly Africa, South America, when the international system, like it did with oil, and even now with the oil, that it pushes down the price of oil, when the oil producing countries are suffering. But the example at that time was for any raw material, like bauxite. They never put the question when the negotiations took place, international negotiations, what is the right acceptable fair price for bauxite? And the analysis by the agencies, by the institutions and research centers in the north was that if the price of bauxite will be increased, it will destroy the economy of our northern economies. So the worry was, look, if you give a better price for the raw material, you destroy our economy. But they never put the other question on the other way around. What happens to the bauxite producing countries if the price of bauxite is not increased. At some point they don't have any more raw material. I know it personally, the situation, for example, production of coffee. I lived 3 years in a coffee producing country, Costa Rica, and I followed just my interest that how is the price of coffee decided and determined. And of course you have a big coffee producing country like Brazil, and you have in Africa who determine the global price, but when there's a bad weather, bad conditions, the whole coffee production may be a catastrophe. So many other things go into fish industry and so this was the emergence of demand for change. And it led to the UNESCO activities that I explain in a few minutes. But it also led to the situation that United States and England, UK, as well as Singapore, left UNESCO in protest. They stayed outside UNESCO for several years, and then they came back in the 1990s when the problem of the media and freedom of expression was, in their mind, solved. And the whole issue of non-aligned approach somehow disappeared for the time being. But now we are coming to a situation that the world order again is being discussed. And I try to analyze very briefly these developments today. The column on the right side, which I have put there, 1991 onwards, the years are not so exact. This is not mathematics, except that Cold War was declared 1948, so we can say that this was the starting point when Churchill and the British warned about the spread of communism to Europe, and the Americans backed, and there was a hunt of communist hunt or witch hunting dominant in the United States. I do not know, but my guess is that one of the reasons of the communist witch hunting inside the media, the Hollywood stars, the media, was that the Soviet Union was able to somehow get perhaps intelligence of the American nuclear atomic weapons, and they developed their own weapons. That was a desperate fear of Americans at that time, Western, that Russians are equal or becoming equal in the nuclear atomic field, and it must be caused by a leak inside the American. I say this because now we are saying the same situation, that Russia is seen, not communism, but Russia is seen guilty for almost anything that Americans see as a problem, or even the Europeans at the moment. And is it so that Russians are really so nasty that they are guilty for everything? Probably they are nasty and also do their guilty things, but also it could be that Russians have also acquired new media and digital media skills and competence, not only with the Snowdens and other sources, that they are really causing a worry in the same way that communism did once. I don't know. I'm just raising the issue that is it because of this, or is it because that you have so much economic problems at home that you have to find an enemy? And you don't define the enemy China because it's too big at the moment, but you can find someone else like Russia. Right or wrong, just take it as an opinion that I don't have. I don't want to argue pro or against. But I do argue for my list here that we have had, after 1991, we have had unipolar world, which means that the bipolar world, or the Cold War, is disappeared, and there was no non-aligned bloc existing. It still is, but it is more or less on paper, like any wavering away. Unipolar world, is that really, should we have the word disruption? Or should I use here a word from the Chinese vocabulary, a new era. A new era. That's what the Chinese are using when they describe their own ideology. Socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. It could be. I use the word disruption because I am not the Chinese, and I cannot say how widely we can share a new era. It could be, but disruption only means that we are moving to something, and this is unstable, unclear, and very difficult. And in the media field, we start a war on terror was started in the Gulf area in Iraq, and later on after the 9/11 war on terrorism, which we don't know for sure what it is in the media. It is reflected, but what is the goal and what is the enemy, and when does it end? If you declare a war on something, you should have something in mind. Is there an end, or is it an endless, permanent, continuous way of life? Personally, I don't accept. I think that if you have declare a war, there must be some sort of understanding how long you will stay in Afghanistan, how long will Iraq war or Syria war continue, and so forth. But the new order, the old propaganda vocabulary is returning. And not only because of internet, but because we use the same psychological means, and instead of promoting in the Cold War era that democracy and human rights from the Western point of view needed to be spread to the rest of the world, defined as universal. It's a controversial thing. Is it such a thing? But that was the belief. Now we are coming to, in the propaganda and in the media, we are defending Western civilization, or we are defending or building our own civilization, or Russian civilization, or others. So that's why I wanted to have the topic on this issue, and there's no final answer, but this is ongoing. And I want to clarify a little bit of it. And still, before going to deeper analysis, the new services, global media services, emerged in 2009, 2008, 2010, 5-6 years ago. Among them, the newest one is the Chinese global television. Of course, CCTV was there before. It changed its name, and it is now, it's part of the CGTN, and the radio propaganda continued very much the same as it was before. But now, as I will show you, in terms of budgeting and in terms of hours spent and activities, this cultural defense or cultural era is part of the new era. We already discussed how much, for example, China is putting efforts for publishing cultural video film. It's the biggest producer of film already. And so RT, the Russian television, which started in 2008, and it has been a target of particularly American, but also European propaganda, saying that RT, because it's state-supported, it is not comparable to independent Western media, and it's propaganda, and it's interfering into many things, but particularly elections. So the election process and new media, social media use with RT is now the Western approach, and RT is trying to defend its approach. And just by incident, because I spoke to you about the Catalonia and Scotland 2 days ago, there was a new service in RT hosted by Scottish First Minister interviewing Catalonian president in exile in RT. I have it on tape, but just showing you how clever advanced and sophisticated the daily propaganda today can be. Al Jazeera, the Qatar-based broadcasting, was a kind of consequence of the Arabic, or basically Gulf region intellectuals who were employed by the BBC, but because they saw that the BBC was not reflecting properly things that happened in the Arabic region, they created their own media, and it is very well on the same journalistic standards as any Western media like the BBC. It's in a way, it is, if you compare those two, you will see that the professional skill and content is absolutely equal in quality, but the focus is completely different. They could speak about the same crisis or same conflict in the region, but have very different approach. I have material on that. If you have time, we can look at those things, comparisons. But in short, if you ask your diplomats or your ambassadors who are stationed in those countries, irrespective what political inclination they have, they probably, at least I have heard from several, that you have to follow them both and you get a totally different picture. So can I say that one is right, one is wrong? No. We come to the problem that there are different ways in building the news, different approaches. And in the new media world, I believe that the best we can achieve is balancing the views and trying to build most reliable picture possible